to introduce our next speaker, Professor Cairns Craig, who's Distinguished Professor of Irish and Scottish Studies at the University of Aberdeen. He has published extensively on Scottish and modernist literature. Of course, he has published on Catholic, and he's mainly the general editor of his work in English. We're waiting with much impatience to see the collected poems, the volume that has just come out or will become soon available, as well as the rest of his work in English. Professor Cairns Craig, most recent book is The Wealth of the Nation, Scotland, Culture and Independence, published with Edinburgh University Press. Thank you very much, Professor Cairns, and I'll invite you to come give your talk.
As you can imagine, it is not necessarily the best situation to be in to follow our most distinguished speaker and to say something about him while he's here to take his revenge. But I was asked to speak about the Scottish context, and this is something I have already addressed. Sorry. So I was asked to talk about the Scottish context, and I've already published some work on that, and it's available online. So if you're interested, you can find it in the Journal of Irish and Scottish Studies, Volume 5, Number 1, or in the Scottish Review of Books, June 28, 2013. And I didn't want to just re-rehearse the arguments I'd made there, and so I'm going to try to pull Ken back from France and back into a Scotland which he doesn't necessarily recognise as part of his environment, and to locate him in a different kind of Scottish intellectual tradition, one, the major figures of which he has acknowledged, but who I think tell us something about the nature of Scottish culture that doesn't often get fully recognised. But one of the things about what Ken has just been telling us of his move to France is that he is not alone in being an artistic or intellectual nomad among Scotland's artists in the period after the Second World War. Helen Adam was in San Francisco working with Allen Ginsberg and Robert Duncan. Muriel Spark was in New York and then in Tuscany. And of course, The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie was published as a single issue of the New Yorker magazine originally. Alan Sharp, after two very promising novels, disappeared to Hollywood to be a scriptwriter. Alexander Trochy, of course, was thrown out, or had to run out of the United States, and was in Paris and then in London. And Alistair Reid, of course, spent much of his career in various Spanish-speaking territories, and also writing regularly for the New Yorker. These were all, as it were, artistic nomads, both leaving Scotland, but also travelling through different kinds of territories. And lots of other prominent, but perhaps not so prominent as these, were also geographical and intellectual nomads. So Alan Massey was working in Italy originally. When he came back to Scotland, most of his books were still set in Italy or in France or in South America or in the classical world. Tom Nairn was in Amsterdam and then in Hungary, working in his conception of Scottish culture and its relationship to, at that stage, Marxism, though his particular trajectory was to take him to nationalism. Some of the most prolific travellers, intellectual travellers of that post-war period were theologians, who almost all did their work in Switzerland or Germany, studying theology in various German universities. And then the most profound exponent, I suppose, among people of the Scottish philosophical tradition on existentialism is Alistair Hannay, who spent his whole career in Norway. So this wasn't a one-man migration that was going on in the period of the 1950s and 60s. This was a mass migration of Scotland's intellectuals and artists. And the question is, why did people feel they needed to leave with such urgency this particular country? What was it about the country that was effectively, apparently, driving people away? Well, in part, of course, it's because Scotland is a migrant nation and exported huge numbers of its people throughout the 20th century as well as the 19th century. At its peak in the 1920s, T.M. Devine notes over 363,000 Scots left for the USA and Canada in a single decade. Now that's out of a population of less than 5 million. So nearly 10% of the population migrates in a single decade. And the establishment of the welfare state in the aftermath of the Second World War did not encourage Scots to stay in Scotland. According to Devine, between 1951 and 1981, 753,000 Scots left the country, around 45% of them for England and the rest for new lives overseas. This is an absolutely remarkable outward migration of Scots people throughout the 20th century. There is no country in Europe which has lost population so rapidly as Scotland has. And indeed, in 2000, Scotland was the only country in Europe, despite the wars of the 20th century, whose population was less than it had been in 1900. And Tom Devine, again, between 1952 and 2006, net migration loss, defined as the difference in the number of people moving to and leaving a country, was about 825,000, described by one authority as a staggering amount from a nation of little more than 5 million. So the artists weren't just leaving, as it were, on their own. You had a whole range of people, mostly skilled people, not the poor who were leaving. It was mostly skilled, working class people who were leaving. Now, that outward migration was obviously caused by economic circumstances in Scotland in the 1930s and the collapse of industry after the First World War, but also the failure to develop industry after the Second World War. But it was also, I think, in the case of the artists, and Ken can keep his question till the end, the case of the artists, because of a particular cultural vision of Scotland, which had developed during what we call the Scottish Renaissance movement, which was supposed to bring about a revitalisation of Scottish culture, but which actually promoted an extraordinarily desiccated version of Scottish culture. This is Neil Gunn writing about MacDermid's Back to Dunbar policy for the Scottish Renaissance movement. Artistically, in the modern world, Scotland doesn't exist. No music, no drama, no letters of any international significance. Why is this all-round sterility so complete, so without parallel in the life of any modern nation? Should not an honest attempt be made to answer that question before attacking the very movement that is trying to do so? And this attitude I call nostophobia. Disgust at the homeland, at the nostos, rejection of your homeland culture. And this is most apparent in the writings between the First and Second World War of Hugh MacDiarmid. Because despite the great creative achievements that MacDiarmid was making in that period, his view of Scottish culture was that it was entirely at odds with or out of touch with the best developments in the modern world. Scotland has consequently become insular and has fidged full fain on the strength of work that reflected only its national degeneracy and its intellectual inferiority to every other European country. Fairly extravagant statement. It's every other European country. The majority of the Scottish writers held most in esteem by contemporary Scots were or are too unconscious even to experience the sense of frustration. They were too completely destitute of artistic integrity. Scotland is a culture which has been abandoned by art because it has given no basis for art in its own internal development. And this is MacDiarmid on Robert Burns. It is in keeping with the cultural history of Scotland that such a Pegasus should have had to work in double harness with the clumsiest of cart horses, that Burns's wonderful power of song should have been so prosaically shackled, that his unique gift should have had to manifest itself behind such an irrelevant array of trite platitudinization. Now, Burns, who's in the 19th century the icon of Scottish culture, the representative of Scotland, of whom there are statues in more places than any other writer known in European culture, is now a complete failure, not on his own, but because he was Scottish, because he had to work in Scottish culture. And it is in keeping too with the cultural history of Scotland that even yet he should be most esteemed for the orthodox externalities of his work, for all that is irrelevant to, most opaque to, and most disfiguring of his genius, rather than for the essence of that genius itself. The tragedy of Burns is that he was a great poet who lived in an age and under circumstances hopelessly uncongenial to the exercise of his art. Well, if only all poets who lived in hopelessly uncongenial circumstances could produce a body of work like Burns's, we would be full of creative achievements. This view of Scotland as a failed culture is the one that MacDiarmid and others of the Scottish Renaissance movement promoted. And the failure went all the way back to the Reformation. The Reformation was the reason for the failure of Scottish culture. It had deformed Scottish spirituality, it had clamped down on Scottish artistic creativity, and it meant that Scots lived in an impoverished culture whose past could be of no relevance to its future. You couldn't use Scott or Burns to write about Scotland's future. As T.C. Smout said in his History of Scotland, Scots walked into the future with their heads turned backwards to look at Walter Scott's Scottish past and Burns's dead language. Scots are people who have no future and cannot see a future, and whose culture has no meaning to the future. And that famously was summarised by Edwin Muir in his book on Scott and Scotland, in which, as with MacDiarmid's account of Burns, he says that Scots' faults are not particular ones, and so I was forced to account for the hiatus in Scott's endowment by considering the environment in which he lived, by invoking the fact, if the reader will agree it is one, that he spent most of his days in a hiatus, in a country, that is to say, which was neither a nation nor a province, and had, instead of a centre, a blank, an Edinburgh in the middle of it. Now, this is being said in the 1930s, and Edinburgh in the 1930s is a blank. This is the city of the Scottish Enlightenment, of the great figures of 18th century Scottish thought who are recognised all across the world as major influences in the development of modernity. But for Edwin Muir, it didn't exist. And there's a very simple reason for that. The Scottish Enlightenment did not exist until the 1960s. Nobody had the concept of a Scottish Enlightenment. There was Hume, whom everybody rejected because he was an atheist and a dangerous character. There was Adam Smith, who'd been appropriated by free market capitalism. Everything else was dead. And those characters, as it were, survived because they were un-Scottish, not because they were Scottish. And this nostophobic tenor seeps into some of Kenneth's early accounts of Scottish culture. So, for instance, in Scottish Ground, we all know what Scottish culture is, don't we? That mixture of the common sense and sentimentality, of social realism and airy-fairy, of Gaelic piety and lowland pockiness, etc., etc. We all know about Scottish identity, porridge and the people's friend, and all the rest of it. And if you write 10 neat lines in Lallans about the whooping cough of your baby boy when you are on holiday in the Cairns, that is Scottish literature, is it not? Now, I don't bring this up as a challenge to Ken, but to show how deep-seated nostophobia was in Scottish culture in the 1950s and 60s. When Scottish International magazine was launched, it starts by presenting Edwin Morgan's poems on the flowers of Scotland, which is an attack on the whole nature of existing Scottish culture. And Scottish International starts by saying, we have to get rid of all of this past and start again. And so the past becomes useless. This is Ken again. A country is that which offers resistance, but in the course of time the resistance wears down, the country gets covered with cliché and becomes couthy or even cruddy. And what Ken did, radically, in his writing, was to turn Scotland back into being Alba. And Alba is the Scotland that Scotland ought to have been, or ought to have remained, rather than the Scotland that actually is there and is the inheritor of Reformation, Walter Scott, Robert Burns, etc. Original landscape, mindscape, and connecting them, wordscape. Getting back to Alba is Ken's way of escaping from the nostophobia of that 1950s, 1960s Scottish culture. And how you get out of that Scottish culture is you have to get out of history altogether. It is history that has gone badly wrong and that you have to escape from it. So this is Ken again. Let's get it straight, boys, once and for all. A bard is one who sings and re-sings the history of the tribe. Being without a tribe and doing my damnedest to get out of history, I just can't be no beardy bard, okay? And in one of the essays in Scottish Ground, he says, the plot thickens, history gets heavier, the contradiction increase in frequency. If the logic of development corresponded with the course of history, general perspectives would be more inspiring than they generally are. But that very rarely is the case. Few are the human communities that know a steady state of evolution. The question is always how, against the mechanics of history, to maintain some dynamic that transcends history, keeping open an alternative space that counteracts history. And as Ken has just been describing, that is an essential part of his project, is keeping open an alternative space that counteracts history. Now, this in fact is not something new in Scottish culture. Being out of history has been a regular theme of Scottish writing about history. And this comes, it seems to me, from the reaction to David Hume and Hume's History of England. Because Hume's History of England is premised on his essay on miracles. There are no miraculous interventions in history. So the writing of history has to dismiss miraculous intervention. It's got nothing to do. People may have believed there were miraculous intervention, but the business of the historian is to tell us what really happened, as opposed to what people believed might have happened. And so what happens as a result is that the supernatural, the miraculous, that which is beyond ordinary understanding, they go into the novel, they go into poems, they go into anthropology. That the non-explicable elements of human experience within a secular, non-miraculous narrative have to be displaced to somewhere else. And much of Scottish literature, including Walter Scott, is actually about how to get out of history rather than how to give an account of history, because it's in rejection of the secular historiography of David Hume. The person I'm about to talk about talks all the time about leaps and leaps of faith, and this is Kierkegaard. So I'm going to make a leap of faith from Scotland to Denmark and to Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard, of course, was a Christian philosopher and usually taken to be the founder of existentialism. And he has this account of the problem of modernity in the 19th century. My main thought was that because of the copiousness of knowledge, people in our day have forgotten what it means to exist and what inwardness is, and that the misunderstanding between speculative thought and Christianity could be explained. If people had forgotten what it means to exist religiously, they had probably also forgotten what it means to exist humanly. Therefore, this would have to be brought out. But this must not on any account be done didactically, because then the misunderstanding would, in a new misunderstanding, instantly make capital of the explanatory attempt, as if existing consisted in coming to know something about a particular point. Kierkegaard's point is, you cannot, as it were, give somebody some new information to replace information they've already had, if that information doesn't transform their actual existence and the way they relate to the world. If this is communicated as knowledge, the recipient is mistakenly induced to understand that he is gaining something to know. Kierkegaard's point is, knowing is not the answer. Being is the answer. You have to be in your human existence, in your passional existence, which is not something statable, it is something experiential. And Kierkegaard founds, not that he knows he's doing it, founds existentialism with a notion that it is not a statable truth that we're looking for, it is an unstatable experience of being. It is, as he calls it in relation to Christianity, the experience of paradox. If you try to make statements of them, they appear to conflict with each other, but you can live with them quite happily and successfully. And I think it's important for this project on existentialism that Kierkegaard is writing in Denmark. He is writing in Danish, a language which very few people read outside of Denmark. And he commits to being part of this small local cultural community and tries to transform it by forcing it to come to terms with the real meaning of Christianity 1800 years after the birth of Christ. And so I've attempted to set out both some elements of Kierkegaard and also the way in which Kierkegaard becomes part of Scottish culture in the 20th century. So the most important thing about Kierkegaard's philosophy is its refusal of Hegel and any systematic philosophy. Any philosophy which is systematic, he says, has no place for the individual, and no individual could believe in a system without negating his or her own existence as an individual. Kierkegaard writes pages and pages about how impossible it is for a Hegelian philosopher to acknowledge an individual human being, because individual human beings are just part of his system. They don't have any reality in themselves. Kierkegaard insists that Christian belief is an immediate relationship with God, and it's therefore beyond history. It's not a relationship through the church or through the historical development of Christianity. It's immediate. It's an I-thou relationship, as Buber was to take it on. And if, in effect, it's a direct communication with eternity. Through that transformation of Christianity that Kierkegaard brought about in the 19th century, of course his impact was delayed because since he was writing in Danish, he had to wait. Not he had to wait, he was dead. But it took time for it to get translated into German and then into French and then to begin to have an influence on the rest of European thought. But Scotland was a particularly important place for the development of this kind of thinking through the influence of the Gifford Lectures. And the most important Kierkegaardian thinkers of the 20th century all came to Scotland to give Gifford Lectures. And I'll point to two here. 1937-38 is Karl Barth, who is the most important and influential theologian of the 1920s and 1930s, transforms the whole nature of theology by his insistence that faith is the most important thing, not argument in terms of Christian belief. And then by Gabriel Marcel in 1947-1948. Marcel was a French existentialist from the earliest works in the 1920s, but he's a Christian existentialist. He converts to Roman Catholicism in 1928. And this often, in a kind of Sartre-dominated version of existentialism, gets forgotten. Existentialism is a Christian philosophy first and becomes an atheist philosophy later. And that it is through Scottish theologians inviting these continental theologians to come to give Gifford Lectures that Kierkegaard comes to exert an influence in Scottish thought. And it is Kierkegaard who initiates the idea that Western philosophy has gone wrong and that we need to go back to before Socrates. This is an idea which becomes attached to Heidegger later on, but it's Kierkegaard who says this. Viewed Socratically, the eternal essential truth is not at all paradoxical in itself, but only being related to an existing person. This is expressed in another Socratic thesis, that all knowing is a recollecting. There is an argument in Plato's account of Socrates that knowing what you know is something you already knew, you just forgot it, and you had to recover it. And the whole dialogic method of Socrates was to encourage people to recover the knowledge they already had, but had forgotten they had. And therefore, knowledge is always retrospective. This thesis is the intimation of the beginning of speculative thought, but for that very reason, Socrates did not pursue it. It essentially became Platonic. This is where the road swings off, and Socrates essentially emphasizes existing, whereas Plato, forgetting this, loses himself in speculative thought. Socrates' infinite merit is precisely that of being an existing thinker. Socrates is the first existentialist, and to get back to Socrates is to renew existentialism for the modern world, according to Kierkegaard. And one of the important figures in this interaction between Scotland and continental theology is John Macquarie. And in Macquarie's account of existentialist theology, a comparison of Heidegger and Glucksman, 1955, he writes, Kant thought it was a scandal to philosophy and human intelligence that there was lacking a cogent proof for the reality of a world outside ourselves. Heidegger's reply is that the true scandal of philosophy is not that such a proof is lacking, but that it was ever looked for. Man as existing is always already in a world. There isn't a world which we have to prove exists. We exist in it, because that's where we start from. And the question, does the world exist, is just a non-question. And Marcel, when he came in 1947-48 to give his Gifford lectures in Aberdeen, had only recently published a book which he called The Philosophy of Existence, which is in large measure an attack on Sartrean existentialism on behalf of Christian existentialism. And he has this to say: I have recently surprised and even scandalized some of Sartre's followers by classifying his philosophy among the techniques of vilification, by which I mean techniques which result, whether deliberately or not, in the systematic vilification of man. Not what people would normally have thought of Sartre, perhaps, in 1947. I admit that, superficially, this would seem to be a paradox, for does not Sartre ceaselessly exalt man in his freedom in the face of the radical absurdity of the universe? Etymologically, to vilify a thing is to take away its value, its price. This can be done in the case of merchandise by flooding the market. And this is just what Sartre does to freedom. He debases it by putting it on every stall. For Marcel, freedom is not just something we all have automatically as human beings. It is something we must struggle towards. It's a lovely photo of a French study, sitting there between these piles of paper and the books in disorder across the back. If you compare it with some of the portraits of German philosophers of the time, like Jaspers, he's always sitting upright in front of straight up and down lines of books on the bookshelves. So let's return to Kenneth White and Heidegger. White points to the ways in which Heidegger moves from seeing philosophy and poetry as two parallel paths to a wayfaring into primal space, and to a later realization that only poetry exists on lasting ground. If, for a start, he welcomed this encounter as the occasion of a fertile dialogue, seeing poetry and philosophy as two neighbouring but separate peaks, he gradually came to see a closer connection, if not an identification. The end of that wayfaring into primal space, White wants to designate in German as Westland, a land where es West, where there is being, a being deeper than anything envisaged or experienced in ontology. And I think, Ken can correct me, that Heidegger is actually the most important existential influence on Ken's thinking and on the relationship between human beings and the natural world. The search for that deeper being, this is Ken again, is what connects wayfaring, travelling the land, to poetry, the search for the poetics of being. Now, Heidegger was very much present here in Glasgow as a result of the work, particularly of John Macquarie, who was teaching Heidegger in the 1950s, but also through the influence of the theologian Ian Henderson, who was one of the main promoters of Kierkegaard, but was also closely engaged with contemporary developments in German theology. And one of the interesting things about Macquarie is that his book on existentialism, published in 1972, situates existentialism in a whole series of radiations out into other cultures. There's a quote just about one of them. Our several ways of philosophical thinking appear to be converging more than they have for many centuries. Some of the themes of existentialism, this is a quote from a Japanese Buddhist, some of the themes of existentialism are, it is said, those with which Eastern philosophy, especially Buddhism, has been concerned for 2.5 millennia. Takuchi mentions as particularly significant the notion of being and nothingness, and the phenomenon of anxiety to which the encounter with nothingness gives rise. Macquarie is trying to link the development of existentialism with the awareness of Buddhism, and to see those as a convergence of East and West, or as an opportunity for the West to move east, to experience an Oriental version of an existential philosophy. And I think that's an important element in 1950s Glasgow culture, is the way in which the theologians were in fact the main conduits of continental thought, and the main people engaged with trying to find ways of linking Christianity to other kinds of religions around the world. In fact, Macquarie became very much someone who believed there were many paths from God to the individual, and you had to come through some traditional religious form. And you couldn't escape those traditional forms, and you couldn't know them all, but you could engage with them. Now, I want to switch from philosophy to something else that Ken has acknowledged, and that is the influence of a particular Scottish thinker on the way that geopoetics develops, and that is Patrick Geddes. And again, this is from Ken's writings. Paleotechnics, industrial society, meant waste of natural resources, blighted landscapes, pandemoniac cities full of factories, offices, slums, and stunted human lives. Neotechnics meant the use of non-polluting energy in an attempt to reunite utility with beauty, city with landscape. Biotechnics would promote new life thinking, leading to more developed human lives, more expanded psyches. As to geotechnics, it was the means for human beings to learn how to really and fully inhabit the earth. Geddes' theories of geotechnics, how for human beings can learn really and fully to inhabit the earth, is a kind of precursor of geopoetics. But I'd like to go in the opposite direction, not from industrial society towards a future society, but from industrial society backwards. Because Patrick Geddes was a professor of botany. In fact, he had a chair of botany established for him at Dundee University. And Geddes, as many Scottish botanists did, used to give his lectures in the Botanic Garden, outdoors, and give his lectures in a botanic garden which he'd helped establish. And this was a long tradition in Scottish culture for professors of botany to inhabit, as it were, a botanic garden as they were giving their lectures. And this comes out of a particularly interesting pathway in Scottish culture, which I will call geobotanics. One of the amazing things about this country in the 18th and 19th centuries was the number of gardeners it produced. All over England, if you went to a large country house, you would find the gardener was a Scot. And Scottish gardeners dominated the London business in nurseries and in plant production. Some of them with very interesting interconnections with France, which we'll come to in a minute. But these gardeners and nurserymen in London were also engaged in the trade in exotic plants and were funding travellers to go out and find plants and send back seeds or send back specimens. So that a huge number of the plant hunters of the 18th and 19th centuries were Scots. And there's a very simple explanation for all of this. One, the Scottish gardeners were better educated than their English equivalents, so they could progress faster. And some of them could get some university education because they only needed to pay for a course. So they could go to England very much better educated than their English equivalents. But also, the Scottish universities were producing medical graduates at a rate that Scotland could not possibly employ. So these medical graduates had to go somewhere, and lots of them ended up as ship surgeons in the Navy. And when they went to foreign places, the first thing they did was go ashore and look for plants. Or indeed, to leave their ship behind and go ashore and found a botanic garden, as William Roxburgh did in Calcutta. And so what this produced was a tradition not only of plant explorers, but of plant artistry. Now this was extremely important because, of course, you had no way of knowing your plants were actually going to get back home and seed themselves or develop. So you had to provide an illustration of the plants. Now, these two are done by Sidney Parkinson, who was on Captain Cook's expedition, and he died in the course of it, but he left hundreds of drawings and sent back hundreds of specimens of plants. And these are by William Roxburgh, done in Calcutta, with Indian artists. And it's a kind of hybrid of Western styles of plant artistry and Indian versions of plant artistry. And these plants were coming back to particular places. Most prominently, initially, Lee and Kennedy's Vineyard Nursery in London. Lee and Kennedy set up in 1745 in London, and were so important that Kennedy's son was given a passport to transfer roses to Josephine during the Napoleonic Wars. He was allowed to come and go freely to convey roses to Paris. Philip Miller ran the Chelsea Physic Garden, which was the most famous for exotic plants in London at the time. And Miller was a famous author about plants as well. And it was in competition with those two that Kew Gardens was established by James Stewart, the Earl of Bute, of course the first Scottish Prime Minister, whose passion was botanics, and he set up Kew Gardens to create the best botanic garden to compete with these other two. And Kew Gardens is always thought of as an English institution, but in fact for the first 100 years of its existence it was run almost entirely by Scots. The head gardener was William Ayton. He was followed by his son. Lots of the plant hunters they employed were Scots, like Francis Masson, going to South Africa, sending back thousands of plants. Geobotanics was a key part of Scottish culture in the 18th and 19th centuries, and what it involved was travel and collection and redistribution. And when I'm thinking about these Scottish geobotanic travellers, it reminds me of Ken's activities when he goes on travels to encounter new territories, but they go back to his atelier to be reconstituted as a waybook or as a poem, and that this process of transformation and wayfaring was an integral part of Scottish culture in the 19th century, and one which is very little acknowledged despite the enormous artistry that was involved. I think of these as haiku as visual haiku. You know, they have to tell you in a very small space a very great deal about the plants. And the other figure that Ken has acknowledged is, of course, John Muir. And why was it that Patrick Geddes and John Muir emerge out of Scottish culture at almost exactly the same time? Two of the most influential environmentalists of their age. What is it that makes Scotland a place that gives birth to these kinds of characters? And they are only the two most prominent. There were lots of them. And Ken has traced some of John Muir's journeys in his book, Winds of Vancouver. And he says this about Muir: "And if in his company I'd heard him say once too often, 'Praise God from whom all blessings flow,' I'd either have suggested he piped down, or, more likely, moved off on my own to a less effusively theistic spot. But to stick at this level would be to look at Muir from the wrong end of the telescope and miss out entirely on the full scope of his intentions, the whole scape of his mind. Muir had vision, a hyper-Heraclitean vision of the universe as an infinite storm of beauty. He's well aware of the toughness of the world, well aware of the forces of destruction in it, but he sees beyond them. Of the flower gardens on his lower reaches of what is now called Muir Glacier, he has this to say: 'Out of all the cold, darkness, and glacial crushing and grinding comes this warm, abounding beauty of life to teach us that what we in faithless ignorance and fear call destruction is creation, finer and finer.'" Now, we all know Muir's enormous influence on the development of environmentalism in North America. And it's, I think, gives us a different sense of what Scottish culture in the 19th century was than the kinds of versions of Scottish culture which were produced in the Scottish Renaissance period, the era of what I call Nostophobia. This is an enormously creative culture, engaged in recreating landscapes all over the world, quite literally rebuilding them by taking our plants to other places, bringing plants from other places to here. We create new kinds of environments, environments which are world environments. The whole point of the Botanic Garden was to have one version of everything in the world. Of course, it became impossible with all the voyages of exploration. But the aim was to have a world garden, as it were, a kind of plant version of cosmos. And there are many interesting characters in this development in Scottish culture in the 19th century. Who knows of John Claudius Loudon? I didn't expect anyone to know of John Claudius Loudon, but he is probably the most important single figure in 19th century British culture, because he develops techniques of gardening and sells books called Applying the Scottish Method to English Farms in the early 1800s, because the Scottish methods are so much superior to the English methods. He makes a fortune out of landscape gardening, landscape architecture as he called it, loses it all when he's travelling in Eastern Europe, comes back and establishes himself as a writer, creates the Gardener's Encyclopedia, the Gardener's Magazine, the Suburban Gardener's Magazine, a whole range of different publications which provide knowledge of this new geobotanic wealth for people to make use of in their own gardening activity. But you can't really make use of it unless you have a greenhouse. So he designs a new kind of greenhouse that allows you to have tall, stately effects of your greenhouse, so that it's not an embarrassment to have a greenhouse in your back door, but is something beautiful. And he designs many of the large greenhouses for the public parks around the UK in the 19th century. He invents the semi-detached villa. He couldn't afford a single house, so he built himself a house that was divided in two, but so neatly done that it looked like two single houses, because you approached them from different directions. But both houses had a garden. And the semi-detached villa was his creation, which then became part of the infrastructure of British cities. The richness of what these characters bring from Scottish culture to elsewhere, and from elsewhere into Scottish and British culture, is absolutely transformative in the 19th century. And there's a particular aspect of this. This is not in my talk, but I'm just going to go off on a tangent for a moment. When Ken was describing the various groups he set up, the jargon group, feuilletage group, etc., he is doing something which is absolutely typical of Scottish migrants. What is most clear about Scottish migrants is they go out to set up institutions. If you look across North America, most of the early educational institutions are founded by Scots. They present the Scottish university curriculum in their particular locations. The botanic gardens are all the creation of Scots. They build them everywhere they go. And of course, the reason they were doing this is because they were in competition with the Church of England. You had to create institutions which were for Church of Scotland people if you're not going to be overwhelmed by the Church of England. So in places like Canada, you get immense ingenuity and effort in creating new Church of Scotland or dissenting academies, universities, colleges, in order not to be absorbed into English culture. And I call this, I haven't got a slide, so you'll need to guess at the spelling of it, I call this the Zenatian effect of Scottish migration. Zenatia, with an X, Zenatia, is another Greek word for a migrant, but it's a migrant who has willingly left home and has no desire to go back. Their desire is to establish the place they came from anew in the place they've gone to. And Scottish migrants in the 18th and 19th centuries are Zenatians. They build institutions wherever they go. And those institutions are the carriers of Scottish culture into new territories and into new possibilities. And the reason for John Muir and Patrick Geddes is one, and here we go back to nostophobia, that you would not necessarily expect. It is the tradition of Calvin's view of nature that encourages Scots to regard the natural world as a spiritual world which it is their job to steward, to look after, and to understand. The final goal of the blessed life, moreover, rests in the knowledge of God. Lest anyone then be excluded from access to happiness, he not only sowed in men's minds that seed of religion of which we have spoken, but revealed himself and daily discloses himself in the whole workmanship of the universe. To read nature is to read God, is to be in contact with God. As a consequence, men cannot open their eyes without being compelled to see him. Wherever you cast your eyes, there is not a spot in the universe where you cannot discern at least some sparks of his glory. Now, for the Nostophobes, Calvin was the repressive force that was destroying Scottish culture. You'll remember that when the Scottish Parliament was being held in New College while they were building the Parliament building, no politician would ever be interviewed in front of the statue of John Knox. your future was gone if you were seen with John Knox behind you. But that repressive, destructive version of Knox has to be counterpointed with this different version of Knox that leads Scots Calvinists to regard nature as God's book to be read, to be tended, to be developed, in order that we can be in touch with God. And that's what you get in John Muir, who constantly regards the natural world as holy and as a place where we're in touch with holiness. In a different sense, it's what you get in Patrick Geddes' accounts of the possibilities of human beings living properly and fully in nature. And it is, I hope, an opening onto a different way of looking at Scottish culture and offering a different travel through Scottish culture than many of the ones we've inherited. Thank you.
What I thought was a really informative, provocative, thought-provoking talk about existentialism, not only in its ecological and wayfaring dimension, but also as a movement going back to Kierkegaard and indeed to, for Scotland, to Calvin and other personalities. Now, I'm sure you would have questions for Cairns. Craig?
While you think about questions, let me just advertise the first volume of Ken's collected works. We're working to get the second volume out, but that is now available, and we're looking forward to having lots more in the future.
Aberdeen University.
Aberdeen University Press, yes.
2017 or? Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation. You made considerable reference, and indeed you concluded, on the question of spirit and God. Yet, in what relatively little understanding I have of Kenneth's poetry and his writing about his poetry, he sits very uncomfortable with that. In one of his commentaries on a poem of Whitman, he suggests that Whitman was almost a geopoetic, and the unease surrounded Whitman's invocation of a sense of spirit. Could you share how you would see Kenneth White's work sitting in relation to questions of spirit and particularly the divine?
Well, I don't think it needs to be the divine necessarily, but I think there's a spiritual energy in Ken's work that takes him into engagement with various kinds of religion. And as in the case, I mean, there's kind of there's two sides to this. In Kierkegaard's case, it is, I have to choose, and I choose God. I can't wait till I get a proof. I've just got to choose God now and accept the paradox. The other side of that is to say, I choose no God, but I still feel the energy, the forces at play in the world round about me, of which I am a part. And Kierkegaard is quite definite that this is a choice that he makes out of a sense of having been brought up in a Christian tradition and wanting to believe in it, but that it is not possible to communicate the basis on which you make that choice. It is a passional choice. It is not a rational choice. And I think a lot of Ken's work has the passion of spirituality about it, but not necessarily an argument about where it's come from or how we're to understand it, or that this is the ground of being in a kind of deistic sense.
It strikes me that his work is, you know, the distinction between apophatic and cataphatic religion. In the cataphatic, you go into it, you say, God is this, it is this, you're affirmative. But in the apophatic, you take away everything. And it seems to me, as you say, that his work is deeply spiritual, but in that sense of wherever he sees a layer, he strips it away to get to that white silence behind.
But in a sense, that is very parallel to Kierkegaard, because Kierkegaard cannot make a statement out of why he now believes. He's made the choice, but the choice is not stateable. And if you were to state it, you would actually make a mockery of it. And therefore, it is an experience which people, and that's why he writes through all these pseudonymous authors in all this very contorted fashion. He wants people to take the journey to the point where they will get the experience, because he can't actually tell them what's involved in that. Which is, I think, quite like the kind of white silence notion.
There's another question.
I found it very informative and enjoyable, Cairns. John Macquarie, could you say a bit more about him? Was he involved in the School of Divinity here in University of Glasgow in the 50s? Because when I came here in the 60s, Prof McLagan was the professor of moral philosophy, and he regarded himself as a Kantian. And although I did honours philosophy, existentialism just wasn't mentioned at all in the courses of the mid-60s. So I'm very intrigued about how Macquarie's writings and his ideas were promulgated within both the university here and elsewhere, because I've never heard of him before.
It's not one I can give you a definite answer to, but he is regarded as the most important theologian in the Anglican tradition in the second half of the 20th century, because he switched from Church of Scotland to Episcopalian and then to Anglican. By the 1960s, he'd gone to New York and was teaching in New York, and then he got a professorship in Oxford and spent the rest of his career in Oxford. So what influence he had in Glasgow would largely have been with theology students rather than philosophy students. And my impression, though I haven't gone and dug into the archives to know whether it's true or not, is there wasn't much communication between philosophers and theologians in the 1950s and 60s.
Well, there wasn't much connection between lots of departments in the University of Glasgow in the 60s, that's for sure, because I did philosophy and history, and the two just didn't talk to each other.
But there were people who worked on both sides of the line. Alexander will need to keep me right here. Downey, R.H. Downey, was a philosopher, a specialist in Hutcheson and Smith, but who was also interested in theological issues. And of course, in Edinburgh, you had John McMurray, who was both a philosopher and a theologian, in effect, or whose philosophy was a theological philosophy. So there were places of crossover in that period. What strikes me as interesting about Macquarie is the way in which he regards all religions as possible routes towards spiritual enlightenment. It's just that you don't have time in a single life to go through them all, but that he's quite happy, as it were, to try to engage with Buddhism alongside Christianity, and that kind of opens up a territory which we can see, people like Ken, people like the Beat Poets, etc., following out as well.
Yes, another question.
Hi, yeah, that was fascinating. Thanks, Cairns. It happens last Saturday. I was at a conference, Connecting with Nature, at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh, and included a presentation by Clean Bulwarks on wind resistance, which for me is one of the most influential geopoetic events of the last 12 months. My question is, how do you see art? You mentioned the pictures of drawings of flowers and whatnot. How do you see modern art in Scotland helping achieve the shift that we're hoping to towards?
Depends where you start with modernism. I mean, if